friend Anton. And again, I'm not reading any script here. You have every piece of information that you need to know about, to learn about Anton. But I want to say that network, they function. They function. So I started working here at Pendle Hill. I met Lena and John, and Lena always said to me, oh, there is a bunch of people that I really want you to know. So she introduced me to Jude Smith, and Jude once said, I have a friend of mine that we want you to know. So Lena and Jude's family invited me to meet Anton, and we started from there. So I am very happy, estoy muy feliz about having you and hosting you here at Pendle Hill, and I am looking forward to learn more about the work that you do and the testimony that you incarnate, through Casa Alterna and through the friendship that we are starting. So with that, this is yours. You don't need that.
Yeah.
So.
No, but I'm going to invite those of you who are maybe in the back to come up. We're a smaller group, and it feels a bit more intimate. We're maybe kind of here in the wings, and is this something? Yeah. Okay. And what I think I want to do this morning, I really was trying to allow our shared experiences, as well as the experiences that I bring with me, to try to inform how I wanted to shape this. And in being a part of so many different dynamic presentations, some were embodied, some were very intellectual, some were very motivating. What I want to do is actually give us a journey, take us on a journey through stories, and a journey that takes us to the heart of hopefully what we're synthesizing together. And I am a practitioner and a student and a novice of liberation theology. I long for a liberation that is mutual, and I long for it to be grounded in a theology that is alive. And so in that understanding, it means that I find myself oftentimes in wilderness places. It finds myself at times confronting powers. It finds myself in moments of celebration and of joy. It finds myself in places of deep lament. But yet I always find myself also in need of community in the midst of that. And so I have decided that what I want to do is share some of those stories of celebration, of resistance, of lament, of community. So some of these stories, as I talk about our life with immigrants, especially those who I refer to as undocumentable, will include some stories of tragedy, of premature deaths, of hardship, but hopefully you can see the resilience of a people who believe that there is a place called the beloved community, and that it does exist, and that we can journey there together. So in that, I was thinking about the Exodus story, as many of us have been, and I wanted to point out a few things to kind of just lay the foundation before I tell some of these stories. Exodus 1:7 is written saying, "But the Israelites were fruitful and prolific. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them." And of course, the land being Egypt. Just last week, I believe it was, in the newspaper, an article came out about a quote-unquote sudden influx of Guatemalan families flowing into Arizona. Now, mind you, this is at the same time that we have this zero tolerance policy where we're learning about children being separated from their families, even to the point now where parents who have been deported, their children have been adopted, legally adopted by U.S. families. as if that wasn't repressive and harsh enough, to then see after that an article that says, even in spite of those things, there was still, quote unquote, a sudden influx of Guatemalan families into Arizona, which has overwhelmed detention facilities there and forced the government to release hundreds of parents and children over the past several days. But the oppressed were fruitful and prolific. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. Now a new king arose over Egypt, who did not know Joseph. Yesterday we talked about, who was it that mentioned historic amnesia? Historic amnesia, or historical amnesia, is not something that happens happenstance. It is designed, it is a part of the system that is not broken, but that is functioning exactly the way it was designed to function. The more that we can disconnect the dots, the easier it is for those who wish to consolidate power to manipulate our fears to be able to do so. So a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph, did not know the history, and yet it worked towards the powerful and the consolidation of that power. He said to his people, "Look, the Israelite people are more numerous and more powerful than we." I wish I could imitate, the vocal styles and the tweet styles of certain politicians these days, right? Those people are more numerous and powerful than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, and they will increase. And in the event of war, join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. Now catch this. First of all, I want to say that what you see here, the twin towers of political power, are nothing more than amnesia and fear. Having a populace that forgets and that is fearful.
Right.
But notice the manipulation and the politics of fear and this culture of fear and this propaganda of fear that takes the truth and totally distorts it, but carries it forward as truth. The people are more numerous and powerful than we. Now that may have been true. I know in the American South, in my county, that was likely true, that those who were enslaved were more numerous, but more powerful. See the distortion? So let us deal shrewdly. Let's justify what we are going to do, right? But why? Well, here's the fearful propaganda, because they will increase, and in the event of war, to join our enemies and fight against us. But now catch this. And escape from the land. It was about subjugation. It's not about deportation, expulsion. It's not about getting rid of the one we fear. It is about control and subjugation of the other. And yet it gets hinted at in this. I mean, everything makes sense if you just want to be a fearful person and say, let's get rid of them because they're numerous and they're powerful and they're going to join our enemies. But we don't want them to escape from the land. I guess maybe because I'm in Pennsylvania, I decided to see what some of the founders of this nation had to say. And so John Adams wrote this. Fear is the foundation of most governments, and renders men, in whose breast it predominates, so stupid and miserable. Now, Adams believed that America would be a different experiment, built upon a different foundation. But now in the 21st century, one could say perhaps he didn't know the power of the establishment media that would help reset the foundation, motivated by greed to help ratchet up our fear of the so-called other and create an environment where we would need a megalomaniac Messiah. But we know from this text that there is always resistance, and that the resistance initiates from below. In this story, it was Shipra and Puah. Two women, midwives, perhaps Hebrew, perhaps Egyptian, but the fact that they're given names, perhaps the fact that they are at the front and center of this act of resistance speaks volumes to me. And you could find video of me, that video, by the way, was only 2 years ago, and I already look a whole lot older than I did. You can find video of me going back to 2007 at Stewart Detention Center, evoking this idea of these pyramids of profit outside these private for-profit detention centers. And invoking the words of Moses saying, "Let my people go," the people who are encaged in this facility of profit, and those who also are the mostly black, rural poor of Georgia, whose economics are dependent upon this corporation and the ways in which it has its grips in these rural communities. Like this mutual liberation of letting my people go. That was all the way back in 2007. But it didn't start with that vigil. It started with those who were on the inside. Salvadorian detainees who decided that they were going to cry out about the injustice of their detention without due process and engage in a hunger strike. And it was our response to their initiative that helped start a movement. And so, if amnesia-laden fear drives us to cry out things like, "Build that wall," then fearless love is what makes us cross borders. Whether that be socio-political borders, spiritual borders, relational borders, interpersonal borders, or the borders and the walls that we build in our own hearts. I thought about you, Francisco, because one of my favorite stories about the border, about our physical border, deals with a young man named Francisco. I was down at the Arizona-Sonora border with Christian peacemaker teams. I was on their steering committee. And I decided one morning to just go for a contemplative walk along the border, along the border wall, the fence. And there it has large slats where you can see through. You wouldn't be able to fit your body through, but you can see through it. And so I just walked along. Well, I decided to go walk, and it was a chilly morning, much like today. And as I approached the wall, I saw a green and white Border Patrol truck. Could tell that it was running. The fumes were coming out of the exhaust. It was there idle. I figured, okay, well, Border Patrol already, in its dawn, are ready to apprehend anyone that is seeking to enter into the United States without legal authorization. But as I passed the van, I realized, no, instead it was running idle with the heat on, and the Border Patrol agent was asleep inside the cabin of this vehicle. So I just walked along the wall and could see onto the other side, and as I was walking, I saw two individuals on the other side of the fence. And I waved them over, and I could tell they were hesitant. They looked at each other and looked at me, and like, who would this person be that's calling us? But they did approach me. And I did as I would do, hopefully, to any of you that when we met, I extended my hand out for a handshake. Now, through the fence, right, through these slats, I extended my hand, and began to engage these individuals in a conversation to find out that one young man was named Francisco, and he was from Oaxaca, which is southern Mexico, and here we were in Sonora, in the far northern parts of the country, and but he was claiming that he was working in one of the maquilas, and he wasn't there, to attempt to migrate or anything like that, but he had already experienced an internal displacement. The conversation didn't take very long when that same Border Patrol agent who was once asleep decided to come screeching up, kick up the dirt, and do his job, and stopped and approached me and said, I need to speak with you. Pulled me aside and he's like, I need to know what you gave or received through our security wall. Already. And I could tell, this was a heightened thing. All of a sudden, about 4 other agents came and two other vehicles. It was me and 5 agents, and they were like, what did you give or receive through that wall? I decided to be honest. I never knew that a handshake could be so subversive, right? I was like, that an act of humanizing the other could be so subversive and so threatening to a situation. I was chastised and told to be careful, that those on the other side tend to throw bricks and bottles and can be really antagonistic, to which I said, actually, I have not found that to be the case in any shape or form. I said, this is actually the most intimidated I feel. And as we're having that conversation, I noticed 2 men jumping back over the fence, back into Mexico, and I was somehow a good distraction for them to be able to So, Alterna, for about a decade, was this intentional faith community. It started with my wife and I adopting our son at the age of 2. He's now 20. And he is originally from Guatemala. And we began to attend an immigrant church, mostly comprised of Guatemalans and Mexicans. In that church, we befriended one couple in particular, Arturo and Norma Martinez. Norma was pregnant, expecting her second child, as were we. But during her pregnancy, as an undocumentable, uninsurable woman, she began to experience renal failure. And I was there when she gave birth to Gabriel, God's messenger, and went from the delivery room into intensive care. And was told that as a woman in her 20s that her life would be truncated and that she needed a kidney transplant. Otherwise, she would depend on dialysis for the rest of her shortened life. But without insurance, and without legal status, what could one do? In that church, everyone referred to one another as brother and sister, hermano y hermana. And so my formation, my awakening, was through that theological sense, not through a political sense of what do I want to do about the issue of immigration, about the injustices that immigrants confront. It was instead, how do I deeply love my brother and sister? And in this case, in the persons of Arturo and Norma. Now, Charlotte and I, my wife, had decided years earlier to live intentionally in a low-income neighborhood, which meant that housing costs were also low. And so a house came up for sale just down the street from us, and we figured out the math, and it had an apartment, and we figured if we bought this house that we could actually offer it to the Martinezes at cost, and with the rent of the apartment subsidizing it, that they could live in a stable place, in a more hygienic place than where they had been living. But we weren't interested in any profit, and so we decided that what we would do is make it an economic equity sharing agreement that said after 3 years we'll consider you co-owners of this home and not make any landlord profit on top of that. They agreed, and we knew that just because we were neighbors didn't mean that we would have intentionality and that we would interact with each other. So we began to say, well, let's also have a meal together. And I was inspired by intentional communities like the Open Door community and Jubilee Partners and Quinternia Farm. But that language escaped, could not translate very well with immigrants. I mean, I couldn't talk about voluntary poverty. They had known involuntary poverty. But they knew familia. They knew family. They knew interdependence. And once we discovered that language of what can it mean for all of us to be displaced from our extended families, as a Puerto Rican in Georgia, as Mexicans in Georgia, as we began to explore what that meant to be interdependent with one another and to be family with one another, life began to happen. But so did this desire within me to really want to live a life of deeper meaning and deeper identity. And so 9/11 happens, and the war on Iraq begins, and I'm feeling this dislocation theologically from where I'm living. I'm feeling this call to move deeper in solidarity with other Latinx communities. And I begin to apply for jobs that would take me elsewhere, and I get offered jobs that would take me elsewhere, but I kept turning them down. Why? Because of my relationship with Arturo and Norma, and because of the relationship that they had formed with the dialysis center, the way they had warmed their hearts and won them over and been able to successfully get dialysis services, knowing that they couldn't just uproot themselves and relocate and get that same thing, and I couldn't just uproot myself and relocate myself. And I kept turning down these positions, and yet I was struggling with my sense of identity and my sense of calling. So finally it was 2005, and Norma was my prophet. Norma was my discernment committee. Norma was my voice of clarity. As she looked at me and she said, in the way that only Norma could, Norma was she was my Spanish teacher. She was always willing to correct me, lovingly correct my Spanish. So much to the point now that my Spanish sounds much more Mexican than it does Puerto Rican. Mande? So she looked at me and she said, why do you think God would be calling you someplace else when there's so many unmet needs here? And the way I rationalize it is Georgia has seen a significant change in the immigrant population. You go to communities like in the north part of Georgia, Dalton and Gainesville, where poultry and textile mills, you can find school systems that are over 50% Latinx students in the north. You go to the very south and the rural farming communities, you can see communities that have been transformed, but not LaGrange, where I was living. It was like 5%. I mean, Alterna, the story of Alterna makes it sound like it's one of those other kind of hotspots to go to, but it wasn't. But she was right, because it wasn't. There were a lot of unmet needs. There were agencies and congregations that had no clue what was happening on the margins, in the shadows, and didn't know the complexities, much as their own complicities, in what it meant to have an undocumentable family in crisis. So in 2005, a couple things happened. We paid off our mortgage. And Charlotte decided that she was going to return to work, and her salary was going to be more than mine was, and our expenses were going to be less. And I was a professor of social work, and I was about to apply for tenure, but instead rendered my resignation. And I even said in my resignation, I said, I have no idea what I'm doing, but I'm following this sense of call. This was 2006, and didn't realize it was the same year that this facility, Stewart Detention Center, would open and now be the largest immigration detention center in the United States. So this relationship with Arturo and Norma deepens. And I remember the journey for myself of realizing how oppression works through this relationship. Arturo has been arrested numerous times, as have I, but mine's for divine obedience or civil disobedience or whatever you call it. but his is for simply trying to drive. To work, to worship, to Walmart, to a medical appointment. He's been arrested for being the victim of a car accident, but not having a license. In the state of Georgia, it can be a felony if you're a repeat offender of driving unlicensable. First offense for driving without a license under Georgia state law is arrest, fingerprinting, which could trigger then an immigration detainer. And if you're released, you have to pay for your car that's been impounded, and your minimum fine and penalty under Georgia law for first offense is a minimum $500 plus court costs, which usually goes up to about $750, and 2 days in jail. And then each offense increases, both monetarily as well as time incarcerated. But I remember one time accompanying Arturo to court. And one of the things that I had been talking about with Arturo was like, what do we do? Like, how do we speak truth to power? What does that look like? But here was a guy who understood it. Because I was echoing in those early years what a lot of the judges and officials were saying, like, stop driving. It's too risky. Like, I was doing it out of compassion, not out of justice. I was like, you need to stop driving. It'll be cheaper if you pay a taxi, right? Those kinds of things. But you have to realize, in the rural South where public transportation does not exist, taxis are about $10 each way and don't come punctually. And it's really, really difficult. Much less the fact that it's just about one's inherent dignity. It was Arturo who taught me as he stood before the judge. And the judge said, I see that you have multiple offenses. When are you going to learn? Why don't you get a license? And Arturo responded back, I would gladly get a license when your country will allow me to. With all humility, he was speaking truth to power. He took the sanctions. I realized what this separation does also to families. We lament the separation of families now through harsh detention policies, but the separation of families has been going on from the moment migration begins. And so when Arturo's father was diagnosed with prostate cancer, and Arturo could only lament from a distance, I decided that I would be a surrogate and travel to his small community along the Gulf in Veracruz to visit with his father who was in the hospital. And I would see my best friend's birthplace, where all the stories that Arturo had told me about his dad knee-high in the stream, net fishing, would come to life for me. All the nostalgia that he was lavishing upon me would just come alive. But it also meant that when I had to go to the hospital and see his frail father, who had really long nails, and the reason why I know he had really long nails is because when he went to shake my hand, these two fingers, he dug them deep into my wrist, the way he grasped. But I could tell that his will to live was strong in that grasp. And I took video, and I took photos, and I could tell that I was receiving a love that really wasn't for me. I was the surrogate. So I come home and arrive in, I think it was the Houston airport. I think it was the connection was in Houston. So I had to go through immigration in Houston. And for some reason I always have difficulty going through customs. The agent was like, so what were you doing? I was like, I was visiting friends in Mexico. Well, what do you do back in the States? Oh, I have a nonprofit that works with immigrants from Mexico and Guatemala. And this guy was was like, oh, well, I used to work for ICE in Cobb County, Metro Atlanta. He was like, there sure are a lot of illegals there. That was his comment. And here I was, I had just come back from visiting the dying dad of one of those illegals. Right? I came back and I put together a PowerPoint presentation. I wanted to show Arturo and his extended family the video and photos that I had taken. And so we set it up in Arturo's living room, and his brother was going to come after his shift change. He worked at a textile mill, and he'd be getting off at 3 o'clock, so he was going to come soon thereafter. Well, soon thereafter didn't happen. And of course I'm thinking, well, this is cultural, different sense of time. But he doesn't come. Finally we get a phone call that he was stopped in a roadblock. We have roadblocks that are still constitutional in Georgia. And so he had been detained and arrested for driving unlicensable. Coming to see photos of his dad. Reminds me of a different time when individuals were detained. This one was we were participating in a freedom ride, a 21st century freedom ride. It started in Durham, North Carolina, with a rally with Reverend William Barber, and then it was going to be folks going on a freedom ride to Birmingham, where they would be on retreat with Vincent Harding. Whoa! I got to be the pit stop between the two times, right? And so what we did in Atlanta was we created this. It was Advent time. And we created a posada for the undocumentable. And for those of you who don't know what the posada is, in the Mexican tradition, it's remembering the ways in which Mary and Joseph, or Maria and Jose, are looking for a place to rest as they await the birth of the child Jesus. But the story is one of rejection. How they are rejected as they seek a place to stay. And so we decided that we would do this walking pilgrimage to Atlanta, and I would point out all the different institutions, the medical institutions, the higher educational institutions, and how the Marias and Jose's of today are rejected. And we ended at the King Center, and we reflected on what it meant to build the beloved community. Then we went to Our Lady of Lourdes, a Catholic church right adjacent to the King Center, where we would have a meal of tamales that would be brought in by a dreamer. At that point, I don't think DACA was even existing. So of a dreamer. Well, she was late. And it was rush hour time, so we figured between cultural differences and rush hour, that could explain why she was late. I knew she didn't drive, but she said she would find someone who would drive for her. When I get the text, my boyfriend has been pulled over by a police officer. Does he have a license? No. Where are you? 2 blocks away. So I look at this group of 30 some odd activist types, it could have been us, it could have been all of us. And I say, you know what? I said, everything that we have been talking about, in terms of ideas and policies, is fleshing itself out. And I said, and I know you're hungry, right? Because it's our dinner too. I said, so I don't know what we're going to do, but I believe in improvisation. I'm a jazz activist. And I think that what we need to do is we need to go the 2 blocks to this location. And it's getting dark now because, it's December, so it gets dark early. And we walk over there, and sure enough, you see the lights. And we approach, and we just kind of form this semicircle around our tamales. And the police officer gets uncomfortable, and he approaches us. He's like, "What are you all doing?" And I decide, since I was the leader of this little posada, that I would be the spokesperson. And I was like, "You've detained our dinner." And he's like, "Well, the driver, made an improper left turn. See, at rush hour in parts of Atlanta, there are certain streets where you can make left turns, but not during rush hour. And that was the offense that got this young man pulled over. An improper left turn during rush hour. But now, because he didn't have a license, he was facing being detained, and that could have a lot of other ramifications. So we held vigil. And a great friend of mine, Steve Pavey, who's this wonderful cultural anthropologist, activist, photographer, is just taking photographs left and right of what's going on. So the police officer comes back and he's like, "What's that guy doing?" I was like, "I don't know, they're all tourists. They're just like photographing." I said, "It's a religious pilgrimage of folks going from Durham to Birmingham. We're at a church." He was like, "Well, if he keeps photographing, tell him I'm going to just have to take him right away." So I go to Steve and I was like, "Listen, you have the right to do what you want, but I just want to let you know that," he says, "if you keep photographing, we'll remove the young man from the premises, take him into custody." So the police officer comes back again and he's like, "Listen, I'm not one of those bad cops." It's like, "I'd like to help him, but he doesn't have a license. I don't know, what to tell you." So I'm sitting there and I'm like, thankfully I've been doing a lot of court monitoring and court advocacy in my local community. I was like, "Well, you know what?" I said, "Under Georgia law, there's a ticket. Like, if you or I were to leave our home without our purse or a billfold and you don't have your license on you, there's a ticket that just is driving, no license on person." I said, "It's like a $25 ticket, no arrest required." It's like, "Why don't you give him that?" And he looked at me, he's like, "It's a good idea." He goes back, to the and I go back to the group, and I'm like, we can tell, like, we're anticipating, like, now, we were hungry for tamales, but now we're like hungry for justice, because we're all salivating, like, what's going to happen here? This is the best appetizer, that we could get, perhaps. And he comes back to me and he's like, "Tell you what, I'm not even going to write a ticket for no license. I'm just going to write the improper left turn and just be done with it." It's like, but just remember, like, not all of us are bad cops. And I was like, "I'm sure you're not." I said, so much so I said, "Why don't you come back and have tamales with us?" To which, unfortunately, he responded, "Sorry, but I've got to give more tickets." ¿Hasta qué, güey? ¿Hasta 10:15?
Uh-huh.
10:15. Okay. All right. I'm going to be mindful of my time. At the burning bush, God says to Moses, "I have seen the misery of my people. I have heard their cries on account of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings, and therefore I will come down." Theologian Walter Brueggemann points out all the pronouns, right? It's I. It's God who sees, God who hears, God who knows, God who comes down. But then we know the story that then God turns that and says, "And therefore I will send you." The work of liberation, of deliverance, as this text says, is a work in which human agents get to be participants. But it also means that we need to be open to have our eyes open. We have to take the risk, and in our North American culture, where what we often want to do after our eyes are open is we want to go do, fix, build. We have to be willing to hear the voices of the voiceless. And then if we're courageous enough, we have to let our own hearts know the suffering. That's a very intimate word, that "know" in the Hebrew. It's a word of the heart. It's not just an acknowledgement of the sufferings of others, but it's where that suffering penetrates to the very core of who we are. I want to read a poem that my younger son wrote that I think also ties to something that was said here. This poem was written by my son when he was either 13 or 14 years old. Shadow of the past. We stand in the palms of ancestors. Dwarves in the shadows of giants. So much created, yet so much lost. With each new society, prejudice is created, raising some to mountains of prosperity and forcing some to lie in desolate canyons of despair. You can't make changes as a person, yet together as a people, mistakes are repeated while corrections are ignored. We think in the future, yet we dwell in the past. History constantly cycles so that our past is our future. Changes only make consequences, whether positive or negative. The circle will never stop unless we humans disappear. The final poem I'll just stop there. In September of 2016, I was in Chicago for a speaking engagement. Was already reluctant to go because Norma was once again in intensive care. Had been for the 14 years that we had known her, on and off. Congestive heart failure. But this time was serious. But I was going to be gone for 24 hours for a speaking engagement. So I had dinner with Eli and my wife. Our older son was doing junior and high school social things. And then I went to the airport. I never got to give the talk that I was scheduled to give because in the middle of the night, in that September of 2016, just a couple months after that video that you watched, I received a phone call that our 14-year-old son had died by a psychosis-induced suicide. And then less than 40 hours later, Norma did pass away. And so their funeral was a shared funeral. And I don't want this to be like, I hope I didn't jar you, I hope I didn't, what I want this to be is an understanding of how the depths of a love that crosses borders can be. Of how, when one sees and hears and knows deeply the sufferings and the resiliency of others, how transformative that can be. So that when we had our adoptive son walk into this church filled with strangers, and we thought that the way we could build relationships is by teaching English and singing in the choir with them, to now have our youngest son laid to rest in a shared funeral with a stranger. There are borders that we still don't understand and we still don't know. But love crosses every border there is. So obviously, the pain of just one of those losses, much less both of them within a few days, can be incomprehensible, unimaginable, and dealt with the type of depression that confines one to bed, the loss is unimaginable. But through therapy and through spiritual direction, when we started to realize that we had to kind of have a resurgence and a rebirth of vocation, I realized that the way that healing would happen for me would be to go further into my relationship with those who are unwelcomed in our community. And so we sold our home and moved a mile, leaving still behind 4 immigrant families who are on the path to home ownership and all of those things, but moving into a neighborhood where we rent alongside 28 other immigrant families with 50 children under the age of 18, where the culture is still very much like Guatemala, where the culture is still one where people and children are outdoors when they're not working, they're on front porches, they're interacting with each other. And I thought, well, here was my thought. My thought was, if I move into this neighborhood that we moved into a year ago, and all I could do is just love those neighbors, that would be enough. If I could continue this charism of hospitality, if I could be the one who would welcome the stranger, that would be enough. But what I realized in being there, I realized that once our son died, it was amazing the ways in which our immigrant friends would lavish us with love. Mostly in big old cartons of bottled water, but lavish us with love. And indeed, when we moved into this neighborhood, I learned that I was being welcomed as the stranger. The cultural differences made me the stranger. The broken one made me the stranger, right? I realized that welcoming the stranger wasn't, that if liberation is about being within and without, that I realized that it wasn't just how was I wanting to see liberation without, but what was liberation within. That it wasn't just about me welcoming the stranger outside of me, but it was me loving the stranger within my son. The stranger that I didn't know, that I was ashamed of, that I was carrying the shame of that stranger within my son. And the liberation that came when I could look at the stranger within my son and welcome him. The stranger that was within myself that I put on mask. To say, I need to promote this persona of being this activist, of being this spiritual person. And say, no, I need to be vulnerable. I need to embrace a culture of being naked and unashamed. And to me, like, liberation looks a lot like the garden, where there's vulnerability and grace. And so we don't know where we're at, where we're going from here. We know that once we moved into this neighborhood just a year ago, I started just doing some people's history about this location. And we organized a freedom school this summer for the 50 some. Well, we had about 25 of the children because that participated in the freedom school. Some of them were way too young, and some of them were already working, helping their parents. But we organized a freedom school this summer, and we learned together on the first day about the land where we live and the creeks and the woodlands who had been on that land. It was interesting, though, that our teacher said that when I probed the person who was teaching us, I was like, can you talk to the students about how those people were expelled from this land in 1829? And she was like, no, that did not happen. This was quite different. We Macintosh and Troop negotiated a sale of this land. And she went on further to say, kind of like if your parents, when they decide to sell their home and move, I was like, no, these kids' parents' experience is probably a lot closer to your recollection or your revision of what transpired. And the next day, we walked a block away to a little street called Red Line Alley. Now, grant this, you have to understand, where we live is actually in the wealthier, wider quadrant of LaGrange, but has these two pockets. And Red Line Alley is a historic black community. I sat down with my friend who I used to go to church with for many years, Miss Maddie. She's 85 years old, and we sat under a tree and she was in a rocking chair and all the kids were on the ground, and she shared stories. Because she grew up on our street when it was a dirt street and it was known as Goose Holler. And I told her, I said, Miss Manny, I want to get the city to recognize and recover that historic name. She's like, hey, never going to happen. She talked about how her daughter was one of the first to integrate our city schools, how her daughter was one of the first to have an administrative role in our segregated hospital. She didn't believe that the city would want to recognize Goose Holler. So we equipped these young kids And at the end of the 2 weeks, 3 of the kids from our neighborhood, average age about 12, stood in front of the city council and the mayor and educated them. Like, it was great. We have video of it. I should have. We have great, little Jefferson, little bitty Jefferson. Like he talks about how Miss Maddie was their teacher. And then Miss Maddie was present, and in his broken English, he says, if we could applause Miss Maddie. And then he talks about how he learned that Miss Maddie's daughter integrated LaGrange High School, and he went on to say, and that's the high school I plan to graduate from. I mean, what a story of hope and resilience. As we know that the high school completion rates, push-out rates, dropout rates, whatever you call it, for Latinx students. Our city council is divided, perhaps predominantly because of the way we do our districting. So we have 3 African American city council persons and 3 white city council persons and a white mayor. So by the time the 3rd student made the formal request for a historic Goose Holler sign, and the mayor said, does anyone want to make a motion that we accept this? Like, the 3 African American city council persons were stumbling over each other, wanting to be the first to make the motion. And it was unanimously supported. One of the other things that we discovered is on our little street, there's an abandoned lot that when we first moved in there was a dump site. I mean, people would just dump their large debris. There was a dumpster that was always overflowing. We've been able to clean that up, and we developed a little pocket park. But what I learned through Miss Maddie was that on that lot was a church. And that church was called Welcome Baptist Church. In 1952, it was burned. The white newspaper says unknown causes. Miss Maddie said we always believed it was arson. It has been relocated into Red Line Alley, but at that point, Goose Holler was the center of 3 little enclaves. And so now that park is called Welcome Park. I don't know if I left any time for questions.
Yeah, you have until 10:30, really.
Oh, okay.
Like when, you know.
Well, but folks are going to want a break. I know how you got to pace your day.
Yeah. John?
Questions don't seem to be the right thing.
Question or comment? Yeah.
But I think we should thank you very much. And for me, you are saying that vulnerability is vulnerability and grace has been a real opening. And I'm very grateful for that.
Blanca?
I was just curious about, I heard yesterday and today that you using the term undocumentable, and I think over the time I've learned myself, why not to use illegal, like still my history is that, and then undocumented, and I was just curious about the reasoning behind using that term instead of undocumented.
The reason why I use the term undocumentable is that, I don't know, maybe at least in the South, if I speak in forums where it's educational about immigration and I use the term undocumented, inevitably the question comes back, well, why don't they get documents? As though they're, and so I work a lot with Mennonites, and I joke that I am an undocumented Mennonite because it shows that I have a choice, because I would say, well, our Mennonites, community is real central, and I don't live near any Mennonites, so how can I be one without a community? But if I use the term undocumentable, that means that then the question is, well, why can't they? Instead of why don't they? So unlicensable, uninsurable, it's just...
I would just...
I want to say, if you are not using the mic, please project,
Yeah.
because I need to pick up your voice.
You want me to switch to...
Yeah, let's do that.
I'd just like to extend that a little bit to say I really appreciated the language, and we'll start using it because within the international community, we're seeing more and more disasters, and one of the prominent recognitions is the right to documentation, a global recognition of the right to documentation. So in disaster zones, people often lose records, and that restoring the documentation of people is a global responsibility for us. So when we say that a person is undocumentable, it's a violation, it's a direct violation of the rights to people to documentation. So there's some interesting additional extension that we could add to that. So thank you very much, I appreciate that.
Did we hear the final poem that you referenced?
Again, so we published our son's final journal, which was all poetry. He's written, he was 14 when he died, but he left 4 novels, 3 of which are still unpublished, and then this journal, these journal contents. And it's in reverse order. I won't go too much into all of that. So the last poem, which was the first poem, which again I think speaks to what I hope, and this is a different conversation, but what I sense that we live in a time with so much despair and despondency, and we're seeing that suicide rates are skyrocketing, and I see within the activist community that same anger and cynicism and despair that is not rooted, and so that's why I love this notion of liberation theology. I mean, what is it that roots us, that sustains our hope against the seeming hopelessness? Now, my son's circumstances are different, but his act and his thoughts are of that same philosophical vein. So he writes, this was his final poem. It's entitled Arcanus. Mysteries cloud my vision, questions unanswered. My ponderings escape me as a strange feeling occurs. First, I feel the emptiness. My mind is separate from the body that others see me as. The name I have holds no meaning. Next, I see the dark mist covering the faces of others. Their peculiarness and strange qualities make them feel superficial and false. Socialize, I am told, don't be unusual. It struck me, a question, like a bright lightning bolt. Am I the stranger or are they? They say age will show me the answer, yet time feels just as abnormal. So what can I trust is true and what can I know is false? As I gradually lull to sleep, I ponder one more thing. Perhaps my mind is deceiving me of reality.
Hi, Anton. I think I was really struck by your speaking about the amnesia and fear and the anecdote of fearless love and crossing borders. And I think thinking about fearless love, maybe I'd just like to hear you talk more about what that means. I find the refrain in my head of Dorothy Day's quote about love is harsh and dreadful as compared to love and dreams. I think she's quoting Dostoevsky. But thinking about, I think especially from the perspective of white activists, that we might romanticize what fearless love, and that fearless love might in fact be naive love in response to communities that have a long history of trauma and oppression and that we have participated in. And so what does fearless love look like? How is fearless love practiced as just love, I guess?
I think that fearless love is first and foremost embodied. And so it takes the theoretical and it shifts it from the policy. I mean, it doesn't negate like the works of undoing systems or the macro work, but it shifts it from being just something that is ideological and makes it incarnational. Right? And that to me then makes it radical. So someone like Dorothy Day embodied a radical understanding of love. Even pulling from the Catholic mystics of doing small things with great love. But what I think is hard, even for me, and now triggered with issues of anxiety, what's hard is how do you embody love and risk making missteps in a time where so much is changing. Like, what does that vulnerability and grace look like in a time when we are rightly dismantling so many structures of oppression, and yet struggle so that love is first embodied and then it's invitational, like instead of the other way around. Like, I know a lot of young people who come visit Alterna and be like, I want to start an intentional community, meaning I want to experience a communal sense of love. I want to do that, and then they get kind of befuddled when I'm like, well, start. Like, find a group of people that are on the margin. Displace yourself. Like, usually it doesn't start that way. They want to find other college-educated, white folks to do community with them. And then somehow that's going to open up the space for others. So to me, that love is first embodied, and then it's invitational. Like we first embody it, then we invite others. If all we do is invite, then that's what a lot of our culture is. If only. What I think we need is that it's always like I always have the solution up here. But we need the ashrams. We need the demonstration plots. We need, and so I am fine. I love the small experiments of great love. And what I need now in those spaces is a place where I can be vulnerable and receive grace. And in that, I need to have my blind spots removed. I need to know where I still, what my flaws are that I bring into that community as a painful mirror. But I need to know that even in the midst of that I can still find a mutual love. Yeah. So it doesn't mean fearless like Nina Simone, who said that you want to know what freedom is no fear. I'm like, I'm never going to be free then. If freedom is no fear, I'm a long way from being free. Right? But if I know that there's a love that's greater than that fear, then there's those moments when I'm emboldened to confront those fears. And I get glimpses of freedom. Maybe just one more, because I don't want to be the ripple
we have
of
one more
trickles.
question here.
Yeah.
Oh, and maybe the two more last question.
Okay.
Yeah, Jose and...
So I just want to say thank you. You've given us so much. And also, thank you for having the courage to do the really hard work and not just, again, go to meetings with college-educated white folks, but actually be in community with people. And we don't understand what that means. And we couldn't be more different, you and I. Like, I go into the halls with wealth and power and argue for people's humanity, and you're living among people with humanity. And I hope that you continue to share that. Because I'm just shocked.
I'll pause you there. And there's dangers in both.
Yeah.
There are dangers in both. Like, I recognize I'm the one who's here standing, not my neighbors, right? I recognize that all of a sudden can be mischaracterized as somehow saintly. I'm trying to work out my salvation from this system just like you are, right? So don't put me on a pedestal because I can knock it down myself.
And just the last thing I'll say is that just across the street from me, well-meaning liberals are being bombarded by commercials saying that X candidate supports sanctuary cities because, of course, brown people are really dangerous. And this abounds us in all of our communities. And I just want to say thank you, and I hope that you continue to courageously do this work and speak about it, because we got a long way to go. So thank you.
Yep. We had circumstance last fall where ICE was doing raids in our neighborhood. So now I actually, in my own country, have a sign up on my window that says, I know my constitutional rights, and if you are a police officer or a federal agent, you cannot enter. Like, I have that alongside with my neighbors, but when the ICE agents were doing the raids, here was what was happening. Children were going to catch their elementary school bus. We're a cul-de-sac, so they're at the opening at 6:45 in the morning, same time that their parents who work shift hours were leaving for work. And the way they leave for work, because of our laws, is they hire licensed, so usually legal permanent residents or U.S. citizens, to drive them. Now those individuals tend to also be Latinx, just to make for communication and language. But as these drivers were leaving with their cars or minivan filled with workers, 2 unmarked vehicles would be waiting at the opening, as the children were also there waiting to catch their bus. And as they would leave, these 2 unmarked vehicles would pass them and then turn on their lights, and they were Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE agents. And they were detaining folks like me, U.S. citizens, under what premise, under what guise? Like, why would a federal agent be stopping a motorist on a public road? So I had to file complaints with our local police department, who did not know that they were conducting these operations in our community, and they were concerned about the nature of unmarked vehicles and plainclothes officers stopping drivers. And then I also filed a complaint in D.C., and we actually had someone from the Department of Human Homeland Security come down from their Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties. So it is a both and, yeah, you're right. When one displaces oneself, the issues still aren't mine. I can still always walk away, and that's the tricky thing of privilege. But our lives become enmeshed in ways that they could not any other way.
And we have the last question here.
So what are some tangible ways that love that allows you to keep going in spite of fear? So what are some tangible ways that love manifests itself that has allowed you to sustain your work?
Well, some of my friends here from the Open Door community, I love Ed Loring's statement that justice is important, but supper is essential. Something very sacramental about that, right? He's a Presbyterian Catholic worker-esque theologian, radical. So something about the breaking of the bread and seeing, the divinity in the other. And so a lot of it is just kind of that day-to-day mundane, but displacement. So like, who am I breaking bread with? Who am I doing normal life activities with? Not just organizing, not just speaking at a rally, not just getting arrested, but who am I doing the mundane, normal, everyday life with? Well, thank you all very, very much.
Thank you.